Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Happy National Pollinator Week. This is Casey Walsh, Katie, and I'm with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. You can see Secretary Ross up at the top of the screen. She'll be chiming in a moment. But thank you for tuning in to our webinar today, California's Efforts to Restore and Enhance Pollinator Populations. We hope you're staying safe and healthy, and we are really happy to bring you this webinar today. Again, my name is Casey Walsh, Katie, and I'm with CDFA's Biodiversity. I'm CDFA's Biodiversity Coordinator in the Office of Environmental Farming and Innovation. We call it OFI for short. And I will act as today's moderator. And we are thrilled that so many of you have tuned in. There's over 350 people registered for this webinar with a diverse audience of growers, ag business, academics, conservation organizations, ag organizations, and the general public. So next slide, please. I'd like to thank and introduce my colleagues who've helped put this webinar together. Carolyn Cook is the supervisor with OFI. She will moderate the Q&A session. And my colleague, Kim Tengarjaya, with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Kim is CDFW's Biodiversity Coordinator, and she'll help me with some of the panelist introductions. Next slide.
It's stuck. Oh.
We have a fantastic lineup this morning with leading experts in the field of pollinators and pollination. We have academics, grower organizations, conservation organizations. So we're really thrilled to present this today. The webinar will be recorded. We will make it available at a later date, so you can access it at that time and hopefully share it with farmers, because we know this is not an optimal time for them to be tuning in. The webinar will conclude at 11:30, but we will leave time for questions at the end after all the speakers. Please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, to submit your questions. If you want to direct your questions to an individual speaker, that's fine. And we apologize in advance if we're not able to answer all your questions. Now, at this point, I'd like to introduce Secretary Karen Ross, CDFA's secretary, who will give the welcoming remarks. She'll also provide a brief tribute to Christy Heinz, a leader in the area of agriculture and pollinators, who recently passed away. Karen Ross has served as the secretary of the California Department of Food and Ag since her appointment by Governor Brown in 2011. She was reappointed secretary by Governor Newsom in 2019. Secretary Ross is recognized for her leadership in agricultural issues nationally, internationally, and here in California, including the areas of environmental stewardship, climate change adaptation, and biodiversity. Prior to her service at CDFA, Secretary Ross was the Chief of Staff for USDA Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack. She's also held leadership positions with the California Association of Wine Grape Growers and the Ag Council of California. Thank you, Secretary, for joining us today. Welcome. Happy Pollinator Week.
Happy Pollinator to you too, Casey. Thank you. And really, it's so wonderful that we're doing this today, all about pollinators. And obviously, I don't have to tell you how important pollinators are for California agriculture, for our ecosystems, and for our very dependence on food for life. You're joining us today, so you probably know a lot about that. Now, normally, I would really spend my time talking about a great program we have at CDFA, our Be Safe program, because it's such an exciting addition to what we do in our plant health division, but you're going to have the experts talking to you about that in just a little bit. I'm sure that many of you who have tuned in already understand the significance importance of pollinators as a keystone species. They have a huge role in our environment and just literally holding our ecosystem together. They're also important to California agriculture. It's estimated that more than 2.5 million honeybee colonies throughout the United States pollinate an estimated $15 billion of crops each year. That ranges from almonds to zucchini. We grow a lot of those here in California. Approximately 1.8 million colonies are used in the pollination of California's almond crop every year. In fact, during almond pollination, we have simply the largest pollinator project going on, and I'm sure Josette will talk to you more about that. The value of pollination just in California alone is $11.7 billion. So it's important, just as we're doing now in COVID-19, taking care of one another to protect one another, it's equally important that we all do our part to protect our pollinators. We know that over the last few decades in particular, the concern has increased because of losses to both our native pollinators as well as our managed pollinators. This is happening on a global basis. Pollinators are under threat from habitat loss and loss of forage, not having a good diet to eat. There's also exposure to pesticide and herbicide use that also contributes to the loss of our pollinators. There's disease and parasites, and so really working with our beekeepers to make sure we've got great sanitation habits and that we're protecting those colonies from invasive pests is really important. And climate change. We know from reports that were released last year from the UN that the loss of biodiversity, the loss of insects, it's hard to get excited about insects, but everybody loves a bumblebee and butterflies. We all have a role that we can play in that. We need to protect our pollinators so that we can maintain the rich biodiversity that we have here in California. And that's why I'm so pleased to have the partnership that we have with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's lots of work for us to do, and we've been doing it. It's estimated that California, as a biodiversity hotspot for native bees, has about 1,600 species. That's a lot. We've got a number of studies that have helped us design programs like our Bee Safe program. Bee Safe is a program that's housed in our Pest Health and Plant Prevention Division. It's everything from what we do at our border stations to protect the state from invasive species. It's also what we do at our border stations to provide hospitality to all of those beehives that come into the state starting at the beginning of pollination season for almonds, with watering stations and being able to accelerate the inspection process so they can get to where they're going and have some good lunch, so to speak. Our Bee Safe program is a partnership with the Department of Food and Agriculture and with our county agricultural commissioners. Important partnership with those ag commissioners. There are boots on the ground at every county in the state of California. They're working most directly with the folks who are bringing the beehives in, and they've created a very exciting program, a mapping program that will help us know where the bees are so that we can avoid thefts, because thefts happen often, as well as understanding where they are so that they're not being unintentionally exposed to pesticides. We also have our Healthy Soils program. That's a pet project of ours, isn't it, Casey? Our Healthy Soils program is an incentive program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, sequester carbon, and in doing that, several of the practices that qualify for incentive grants to farmers are plantings of cover crops, plantings of hedgerows, putting in riparian buffer strips. All of these help create forage and habitat for our pollinators. And you get extra points when you are doing those kinds of pollinator plantings. And then our specialty crop block grant program for the last decade has funded a number of research projects and outreach and educational tools to help us work with our beekeepers and with our citizens to protect pollinators and especially our bee population. But there's also much that each one of us can do with our own home gardens. We can plant pollinator gardens, and I love it when I go to the nurseries and they show me which ones are especially happy plants for our bees and other pollinators. We can also do our part on limiting unnecessary pesticide use and looking for alternatives to pesticides so we don't get big infestations of invasive pests that really do harm the health of our honeybees and our pollinator habitat. And then there's some really great tools. Everybody has a phone, everybody can download an app and be citizen scientists with efforts like iNaturalist. It's an app that allows individuals to document species sightings. And now I do want to pay my respects and honor Christy Heinz. I started working with Christy when I came back from DC 11 years ago. She was such a champion, bringing together the almond industry with researchers, ag commissioners, beekeepers, to really start to develop partnerships to focus on where are the gaps, what is it that we need, how do we expand the research to make sure we've got the tools in place to make this happen. She was a delightful person to work with. She was a leader, she was fun, and she cared so much. Much of the work that we have today is because of Christy's leadership. I am sorry for her family. I'm sorry for all of us that we lost Christy just recently, but the work that Christy did continues. She was a wonderful leader in the almond sector and for agriculture. And we send our respects and our condolences to her family. I know all of her friends miss her deeply. Thank you, Christy, for everything that you did. Thanks for letting me have a few minutes, Casey. Looking forward to the chat today.
Thank you so much, Secretary. That was wonderful. So great. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Neil Williams. He's professor of pollination at UC Davis and also bee biology in the Department of Entomology and Nematology. He's a faculty co-director of the UC Davis Honey and Pollination Center and a member of UC Davis Ag Sustainability Institute. His research addresses the integration of wild and managed bees for pollination of diverse ag crops and works to understand the factors affecting the health and resilience of native bee population. His team also works to provide practical information that can be used to improve the long-term stability of pollination for agriculture in California, as well as promoting pollinator conservation. So take it away, Neil. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Casey, for the invitation to be part of the webinar today. It's really a great pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about efforts that California is undertaking, or some of the efforts. And also thanks to Secretary Ross for her really insightful introduction. As Secretary Ross indicated, California remains really at the forefront in terms of commitment to supporting pollinators. And because of its large agricultural sector, it's both highly dependent on pollination provided by bees and other insects, and also prevents that agricultural size and scope presents significant challenges for supporting pollinators. Can I have the next slide? Oh, maybe, I'm sorry, maybe I'm supposed to control. I will control. Sorry about that. Forgot about that. Managed bees, which are mostly honeybees in California, as well as wild species, do face a daunting array of challenges that affect their populations, individual health, and the ability to provide pollination services that sustain natural communities and also the agricultural and food industries. These include, as Secretary Ross mentioned, things like disease, pesticides, and also importantly, a lack of sufficient forage. And I want to focus on really this idea of resource limitation for the presentation today. There are, in each case, specific aspects that differ between managed honeybees and wild bee populations, but the challenges really are shared. So forage homogenization, the loss of forage, is a common driver. And really, it's an interesting one because the same sorts of effects are imposed for both our managed bees and wild bee populations together. So we know from studies of different taxa that, excuse me, that resource limitation has interactive effects. So poor nutrition changes also interacts with other elements that are challenges to bees. It can affect the susceptibility of bees to disease and their ability to cope with pesticide exposure. It also, though, prevents real opportunities for conservation and restoration where actions we can take to provide benefits to both wild bees and managed bees alike. So the goals that I have for the talk today, I want to highlight the importance of understanding floral landscapes and habitat elements and some of the ongoing strategies that we're taking to restore those. I'll summarize a little bit of some research that's going on in California, documenting how forage habitat impacts bee populations, and then highlight how this knowledge of plant species that can be used is critical to designing actions that we can undertake, particularly forage plantings to support bees. And I'll close by talking a little bit about some decision tools that we've worked on with the support of CDFA and others to try and improve the design of these forage plantings. So there are several comprehensive summaries of existing studies from many regions, including California, showing that fragmentation and habitat loss lead to decline of both native bees and present challenges for managed bees. In our own work in California, we found that isolation from natural habitat leads to a loss of some of our really important agricultural pollinators. It's also interesting to note, though, that we see variation in the response among bee species, something we call response diversity, in how they respond. So if we look at the proportion of agricultural land cover, comparing that to abundance here in the bottom panel, some species actually seem to do very well and others are severely impacted by change. And that again underscores the potential for managing agricultural landscapes in ways that can promote bee populations. That impact of forage loss on bees has also been shown to not only impact communities, but has important implications for how well their populations do. And this relates to the ability of those individual species to successfully reproduce within agricultural landscapes. This example shows a work from UC Davis looking at how the quality of forage landscape in the top panel here, how forage landscape impacts the number of queens, the reproductive individuals produced by bumblebee colonies placed at different locations throughout the landscape. And it's very clear that as we increase the overall forage availability in the landscape, there are more queens produced by bumblebee colonies. That same work also, though, interestingly highlights the importance of the temporal pattern of resources in the landscape, and I'm showing that in these bottom two panels. We can see that depending on the type of landscape that the agriculture is going on within and that the bees are in, there are different patterns of availability of resources throughout the season. And so this begins to hint at the sorts of things that we might target or try and understand in terms of designing or promoting conservation and management of bees. So in some places we see lots of resources available early in the season with the decline as the landscape dries out, and this is true in natural land dominated areas. In other areas we see actual pulses of resources caused in this case by mass flowering crops later in the season. So I want to talk a little bit, though, about this really important question of forage plants. And again, Secretary Ross mentioned this quite explicitly. If we're going to conserve and restore forage, we need to have a clear understanding of the plant species on which bees rely. Really, the question is, what plants in the landscape do bees actually use? So that's fundamental if we're going to mitigate the loss of those resources or restore what we know. We have to have some targets. That sort of understanding is actually pretty old with respect to some bees. And so interestingly, we have information dating all the way back to Roman times in the Mediterranean, documenting which plants bees were using. And so this is all the way from the writings of Pliny, looking at and documenting moving bees to follow the nectar flow on boats up and down river areas. The modern example of that is also not something that we've only understood in the last few years, but is historic, right? We have published records of floras of honey plants from throughout the US, and California is a particularly good example of this, where we have records of the important plants that provide nectar and pollen to those bees. Our understanding of the forage plants that wild bees use is, of course, much more recent. And I'm showing you here two sort of interesting presentations. These are what are called network diagrams that present sort of the interaction between different bee species. Here you see in the middle of the figures, linking those bees used to a series of different plant species. And the example here of California on the left and another state in the Dakotas on the right. And the diagram is organized to show the progression of plant species blooming from spring through autumn from the top to bottom. The points I would highlight are that bee communities, clearly these wild bee communities, use an incredible diversity, a wide range of different plant species. It also points out, and I've highlighted in blue here, that different species within those wild bee communities focus on different types of plants. So we see bumblebees here focused on just a few plant species, and then other bees are quite different in their species use. And again, there's a strong seasonal component here. So I want to move on and talk about how we would sort of translate some of that knowledge from those kinds of network webs, what plant species are being used, to designing action to promote and conserve habitat for bees. And so I'll talk about focusing on plant selection, which is a critical aspect that I've said before, and how we are testing that empirically in California. And then I'll close by talking a little bit about a tool that we've used to help inform and assist the design of these plantings for different plant mixes for pollinators in with different goals and in different regions. So a first question that we always want to be asking is, are the efforts that we're undertaking actually providing the benefits that we think they are? Essentially, how are these habitats functioning to support pollinators? Do the bees actually use these resources that we're planting for them, and do they benefit from those plantings? So there's been a lot of effort from the various UCs, from the state and NGOs in California to begin to address this question. And it relies on sustained monitoring, which of course really benefits from the support of CDFA and other organizations, to which we're incredibly grateful. I want to present two data sets, one looking at plantings in summer vegetable crops, and you can see those pollinator mixes here, and another from orchard landscapes, and again, that's shown here. And both are from Northern California, and they both use, in this case, native California wildflowers planted along borders of either orchards or row crops in 2 years of study in each case. This work, I think, also highlights, again, the importance of the competitive grants programs that are supported through USDA, NIFA, and NRCS, as well as grants from CDFA, and the support of partners within commodities like the Almond Board of California. These allow us to do really robust and rigorous sampling of insect, in particular pollinator use in these different plantings. And so the details here aren't critical, but in all cases, the way that we approached monitoring is in a very repeatable fashion. So we can actually look specifically at the importance of different plants and how the bees are using these habitats in a comparative way between plantings and control borders along fields where we're not augmenting them. And so we really look at the difference that we're seeing. The results from this work are presented here, and I have the row crops example here with vine seed, with watermelon, and then the almonds here on the left. And in each of these figures, the variable, the data that I'm presenting, show the results for the planting in black and the corresponding paired control sites in gray. And so what these show in the different panels, the top panel shows the impact on honeybee abundance within those plantings, the middle on wild bee abundance, and the bottom on the richness, the diversity of species that we're supporting in those plantings. I think the take home here is pretty clear. The forage plantings in all cases support significantly greater numbers and greater diversities of bees. But importantly, these figures are presented not as one summary, but as points throughout the season. And so again, they highlight that if we design these plantings in an informed way, we can provide support for pollinators throughout the entire season. So the black lines remain significantly higher in terms of numbers and diversity throughout the entire season. How do we achieve that seasonal support? That's done by careful design of the species which are included in those wildflower plantings so that they're informed in a phenological way, this temporal coverage of resources throughout the season. And what we see is if we're careful, we are able to create continuous resources throughout the season. And that's, we can see that in doing that, we see a strong separation of the resources that are provided among plant species over the season. And here's just pictures of some of those, but you'll see that some of those species provide really high flower densities in the spring and early summer, and others come on in their bloom right about now in early June and then increase over the season, providing important resources through the late summer and into the fall, and thus overall presenting forage for those bees. So it's really these complementarities of bloom times and flower forms and rewards that are offered that allow us to achieve these benefits.
Just about 2 more minutes, Neil. Thank you.
Okay, I'll have to jump forward pretty quickly. So these plantings also, we've been able to show, have really dramatic effects not only on bee use, but on their population impact. So these are studies from almonds. We see when we plant habitat on the borders and then monitor bee nesting. This shows a picture of orchard bee nesting from bees placed at different distances. Those bees that are nesting closer to the habitat produce significantly more offspring throughout the season. So I want to close in talking just a little bit about how do we then incorporate this information from this kind of rigorous testing and from data gathered by partners to really improve the cost effectiveness of plant mixtures. Here, the goal is we have lots of plant choices, but we want to select a set of plant species for a given goal that provides coverage throughout the season, but that is cost effective. And so if I take an example of the goal of biodiversity, how do we maximize the biodiversity for a given cost that's involved? And we do this again by using information that we have on when bees are flying, the flight phenology of different species, those interactions between bees and flowers that tells us what are the potential species we could use, knowing about when those plants flower, and then taking into account the differential costs of those various plant species. This is a complex task, but we can feed that into computer algorithms that we've designed to try and optimize mixes that provide the maximum bee richness across a set of costs. And I'm sort of quickly just going to show you, here is in gray a series of randomly selected plant species from a set of about 40 to 50 species, where we've incorporated the cost of each combination of species, and these are random choices, and so they are just kind of a shotgun blast of points of different costs, and they have different qualities in terms of how many bees they support. If we apply the algorithm to try and maximize bees for the given cost, that's now shown in the blue line. And so you begin to see the value of actually applying a rigorous structured decision tool to the process. We can, for any given budget, get the single best combination of plants or the best few sets of mixes that support our goal here in biodiversity optimization. This could be applied to a different goal as long as we could structure that with respect to our model. So for example, we can take a mix that might be many hundreds of dollars, reduce it in half, and still support almost all of those species. And so this becomes important in terms of making choices to support different things. We have applied those that algorithm that I showed you just in sort of a case demonstration to actual on-the-ground conservation NRCS plant mixes and others throughout the country, including California, to try and look at how we could optimize them to reduce the overall cost of mixes that exist. Most of those mixes, or many of them, are quite expensive, and the question is, can we reduce their cost? The answer is yes, the algorithm does that very well. We run the optimization, we see the best mix for California, which in terms of supporting bees, which runs $300 to $400 per acre just for the seed. If we optimize it, we can achieve exactly that same level of bee support for under $100, for about $50. And so from conservation impact, this allows more people to be involved, growers that otherwise would not be able to be involved, to plant this in their farms, conservation organizations to use the savings for other areas. And so overall, we improve the effort towards promoting pollinators. So I'll just summarize by saying, so we know from really great work throughout California that forage loss profoundly affects managed and wild bees. We've been able to show that restoration actions can dramatically benefit them, even in very highly degraded landscapes or strongly impacted working lands. Data on plant preferences and use form a key part of the design of those habitats and their conservation. And I hope that I've shown that we can use some of these new approaches to help guide the choices of plant mixes for different goals, whether that's through CDFA or NRCS or particular growers or grower organizations. Okay, so I'll stop there. I'm sure I went a few minutes over, but thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions that people have.
Great, thanks so much, Neil. In the interest of time, we'll move on to the next speaker, and we'll take questions at the end. And at this point, I'm going to introduce Kim Tangarjaya, and she's going to introduce the next speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Tangarjaya. I'm the Biodiversity Coordinator at California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. Patricia Bowles has been an environmental scientist with the California Department of Food and Agriculture's Be Safe program since December of 2018. And previously, she was an adjunct professor for Napa Valley College, teaching ecology and non-majors biology, and also for Diablo Valley College, teaching molecular and cellular biology. In 2017, she earned her MS in entomology from UC Davis, researching honeybees, Apis mellifera, and Varroa destructor mites. So welcome, Patricia.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm really glad to be part of this webinar with all of you. I will be talking about the Buzz on the Be Safe program. You can go on to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit of background. Back in 2012, the USDA National Honeybee Health Stakeholder Conference report said that there was ongoing honeybee colony losses and were a result of a variety of factors. These are pests and parasites, nutrition and lack of adequate forage, pesticide exposure, and genetics. And Neil already covered a little bit more detail on all of these. So the CDFA, California Department of Food and Agriculture, then secured $1.8 million in state general funds per year for 3 years to implement the Be Safe program. 1.5 million of that goes directly to the county agricultural commissioner's offices annually. And so those are, as Secretary Ross said, all of these boots that we have on the ground across the state. And this is to reimburse efforts to develop, implement, and report on activities associated with the program. Our first grant period was from November 15th, 2018 through June 30th, 2019. And our second one is just about over right now. It began July 1st, 2019, and will be ending the 30th of this month. And then we'll be moving into our third year. Okay, next slide. The main objectives of the program is to reduce honeybee stress through a variety of efforts, such as improved apiary theft prevention efforts. Secretary also touched on this. Decreased apiary pest pressure. This deals in with, partially with the varroa mite, small hive beetle, so forth, American foul brood. Decreased apiary stress due to pesticide exposure, and increased apiary foraging opportunities. So our county agricultural commissioners are granted authority identified in the Food and Agricultural Code to enforce various apiary and pest prevention laws, such as registration, identification and placement of hives, inspection and abatement of pests. And these are intended to ensure the vitality of the beekeeping industry and to prevent the introduction into or the spread within the state of pests. Okay. Next. Okay, so we have contracts with a large number of these county agricultural commissioners' offices. For our first year, we had it with 40 of them. This current year, we have 43 contracts with various CAC offices, and we will also have 43 for next year. Okay, next then as well. So in order to make sure that our county agricultural commissioners' offices are prepared to do this, we've had a variety of trainings. And so we had 6 trainings that took place in April 2019 across the state. You can look at the stars to see where I've all traveled to help out with these. And for that one, we had 143 county personnel attending from 42 counties. And in October 2019, we had 5 trainings in which we had 84 county personnel attending from 31 counties. So you can tell that we have a large number of boots on the ground of people helping out with this effort. Next. Our current focus for these programs is to encourage communication and education between county personnel and beekeepers, to train our county personnel on apiary health inspections, and to promote consistency in the Bee Safe program activities throughout the state with our apiary inspections, our notifications, education, and markings. Next, please. So, some of you have probably heard about Bee Safe, which is what I've talked about, and you've probably also heard of Beware. I know it can get a little bit confusing, especially as in the pollinator world, we like to use bee and everything. So I want to briefly explain the difference between these two. Our Bee Safe program, as I've been talking about, is funded from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and the purpose of that is to provide funds to the California County Agricultural Commissioners to perform apiary-related work. Again, it's all of those boots on the ground. Whereas Beware is a collaborative project supported by lots of different organizations, including California Department of Food and Agriculture, California Department of Pesticide Regulation, CAPCA, and CACASA. And the purpose of this is that it's a mechanism for a software program for beekeepers to register their bees and notify their local county agricultural commissioners of movement of colonies. And it's a mechanism for pest control advisors, growers, and applicators to do bee checks. And so it helps out a lot with making registration really easy and a lot with our making ease of pesticide notification so we can protect our bees from those pesticides. Next, please. So a little bit more then of what's expected of our applicators, growers, and PCAs. Our pest control applicators can conduct a voluntary bee check to determine the number of hives within a mile radius of the proposed site. And so they can go into the program, they can be, okay, I'm gonna, recommend this particular pesticide for this area, and then the program will pop up and say there's, maybe no beehives there, or maybe there's 200 or 2,000 beehives within a 1 mile radius. And so then the pest control advisor, could use that information to potentially use a non-bee toxic pesticide if there are going to be a lot of beehives close by to that proposed spraying site. With our applicators and growers, if they are intending to apply any pesticide labeled toxic to bees to a blossoming plant cell, prior to the application, inquire of the commissioner or of a notification service designated by the commissioner, such as the Beware program, whether any beekeeper with apiaries within 1 mile of the application site has requested notice of such application. And so with this bee check information then, the applicators and growers must notify the beekeeper Beware currently does not automatically notify the beekeeper. They still have to email or call them at least 48 hours in advance of the application. So Beware will then show the applicators and growers if there's a beekeeper who wants to be notified, and it'll provide them with their contact information. And that applicator or grower then has to go and contact the beekeeper and let them know the time and place the application is to be made, the crop and acreage to be treated, the method of application, the pesticide and dosage rate of the pesticide to be applied, and contact information in case the beekeeper needs to communicate prior to the application. And this is all so that we can help to protect our honeybees to make sure there's not a pesticide killing incident. Okay, next please. And so we also have expectations of beekeepers then, and they're to have registration, which is done annually, to notify the CACs of the movement of colonies. And these are both to help out with those pesticide notifications. They're supposed to have proper apiary and hive markings and compliance with local apiary ordinances, which are typically about providing water to the honeybees and distance of the hives from roads, schools, and houses, etc. Next, please. With our registration, all apiaries in California must be registered on the first day of the year or within 30 days of entering the state. And the registration of an apiary is to be filed with the commissioner of the county the apiary is located in. And so it's always best to check with your local county agricultural commissioners to see the preferred method of registration, although most of them end up using Beware. There is also an annual $10 registration fee that is due to the county commissioner of the county the apiary is first located in that year. And this registration fee is only per beekeeper, not per apiary, not per hive. And the registration fee is allowed to be waived by the local CAC if the beekeeper has 9 or fewer colonies. Next, please. Okay, so a little bit more. Oh, go back one. Okay, a little bit more on our registration and movement notification. Beekeepers have to notify both the destination county and origin county of movement of bee colonies within 72 hours of movement. And so this applies to both intra and inter-county movement. And if the county uses Beware, there's a little pin on the map and you can move that around so that, again, this is for these pesticide notifications so that it's available whether or not there's going to be beehives in that area or not. Oh, one other thing I do want to mention about Beware is that all of that information is protected in California. You do not have access to any of the exact locations of those beehives, and an applicator and grower, in order to use the system, has to have a current license, and they still don't know exactly where those beehives are. So I want to reassure everyone that all of that information is protected. Okay, so after January 1st of 2021, our county agricultural commissioners may assess administrative civil penalties for violations of provisions regulating bee management, such as making sure that there's registration of the beekeeper, making sure that apiaries are properly marked with required contact information, and that there is notification of relocation of hives within 72 hours. And this administrative civil penalty will be imposed in proportion to the violation, measured as minor, moderate, or serious, with fines ranging from a written notice to a maximum of $1,000 per violation. However, they're doing a lot of education, and we have been doing a lot of education before any penalties will be assessed. Next, please.
Tricia, just a time check. You have a couple more minutes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So our results for 2019, we had over 900,000 registered colonies for 2019. And for some reference, the maximum number of beehives as estimated to be in California at one time in 2019 by the USDA in their honeybee colonies report was about 1.5 million. So we're certainly getting closer already in 2019, which is awesome because this program's still pretty new. We had 2,093 beekeepers registered. We had 96 BCA bee check reports, 664 grower bee check reports, and 6,053 applicator bee check reports. Next, please. And thus far for 2020, which we're not even halfway through yet, we've had 1.4 million registered colonies, which is, I'm really excited about that. So we probably have almost all of the colonies in the state registered. We've had 2,266 beekeepers registered. We've had 760 PCA bee check reports, 4,750 grower bee check reports, and 13,500 applicator bee check reports. And so this is all really good to help us protect the honeybees in our state. So next, please. And at the end of the webinar, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. That's awesome. Really appreciate that. Okay, and we are going to move on to the next speaker. Next speaker is Dr. Josette Lewis, who is the Chief Scientific Officer with the Almond Board of California. Dr. Lewis oversees research for the Almond Board, spanning aspects of almond production, sustainability, nutrition, biomass utilization. Dr. Lewis has worked in agriculture for 25 years in government, industry, university, and non-governmental organizations. Most recently, she led Environmental Defense Fund's collaborations with grower organizations, food companies, and policymakers to promote sustainable ag practices. Thank you so much, Josette. We're so happy you could join us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. As Secretary Ross mentioned at the opening, honeybees are an essential part of almond production. Pollination is one of the most significant components annually in that cost of production. In fact, it's on par with irrigation and harvesting for almonds, harvesting being the most labor-intensive part of almond growing. So growers have a real vested interest in protecting that investment. Next slide. And the most important thing growers can do is provide a healthy environment during the 6 to 8 weeks a year that honeybees are in almond orchards doing all that pollination. We take quite seriously our responsibility in this area, and to that end, the Almond Board 5 years ago released the Honeybee Best Management Guide. It was developed with input from researchers, state and federal agencies, beekeepers, and growers. And it's really a comprehensive guide addressing the important steps that almond growers need to take, but also the role of beekeepers, as well as pest control advisors and pesticide applicators that growers might hire. So it's very comprehensive, addressing many of the types of requirements that Patricia just spoke to in order to make sure that we reduce risks to honeybees while they're in the almond orchards. And we continue to do training every year, and as well as to update this guidance as new research helps us refine our understanding with the goal of making these best management practices really standard across the entire almond industry. Next slide. Building on that foundation and really going beyond the time that just honeybees are in the orchard, the Almond Board just over a year ago announced 4 sustainability goals for the orchard of the future. This includes a goal to expand the use of integrated pest management tools by 25%. Next slide. And here is our best opportunity to really reduce the risk to pollinators and other biodiversity that is present all year round in and around almond orchards. So we will measure our progress against this by looking at adoption of specific cultural practices and alternatives that can reduce spraying in the orchard for pest management. Also practices that reduce spray drift, and very importantly include our bee best management practices that I just spoke to. Next slide. So in addition to education and grower outreach to shift our practices in the orchard to these more sustainable methods, we continue to invest in bee health research. In fact, the Almond Board invests more funding than any other crop organization in bee health research. And that research addresses the risks as well as how to promote bee health practices. We also fund the development of technical assistance tools and services that can be useful both to growers, but particularly to beekeepers. And it's these investments in research and resource development that allows us to contribute to addressing bee health nationally, because we know that the risks that bees face go well beyond the 2 months that they spend in almond orchards. And again, we have a stake in that because they come back to almonds every year. Next slide. And this week, we're really pleased to scale up our investment in pollinator health as part of National Pollinator Week. We are announcing the alignment of the California Almond Sustainability Program with Pollinator Partnership's Bee-Friendly Farming certification. This is a good way to recognize growers who follow good management practices to reduce the risk to pollinators, but most importantly, go beyond that and provide quality forage and habitat for all pollinators. As you can see in this picture, cover crops are a key component of providing good quality forage and habitat, some of the things that Neil talked about. And so we're also pleased as part of this commitment to elevate our support to Project APSM's Seeds for Bees program. Seeds for Bees is a really extraordinary program that provides subsidized cover crop seed to growers to help defray some of those costs, and also provides technical assistance to help put cover crops in across the state. So as we started this webinar, this is really, for me, a really proud opportunity to build on that legacy that Christy Hines started when she transitioned from her work with the Almond Board to found Project APSM. So we see this investment that we're making through our research, but also here in really going beyond that to focus on habitat and forage as really a big step toward expanding the role that almond orchards play as part of healthy ecosystems for pollinators as well as other biodiversity here in the state of California. So we look forward to continued work with many of the speakers that you're hearing from today as we continue to refine how we can reduce the risks to pollinators and really provide a quality environment in and around almond orchards through things like cover crops, hedgerows, and riparian buffers as part of our landscape in the Central Valley of California. So that's it. Thank you very much.
And now we've reached the final presentation in our webinar, which will be co-presented by two speakers. Dr. Hilary Sardinhas is the Monarch Conservation Coordinator with the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts. She provides technical assistance to resource conservation districts developing and implementing monarch and pollinator conservation programs throughout California's public and private lands. She also focuses on enhancing partnerships to increase conservation effectiveness at state and local levels. Hilary earned her PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley, where she researched the benefits of on-farm habitat enhancements to pollinator populations and crop production. And Dr. Angela Laws is the Endangered Species Conservation Biologist and Climate Change Lead at the Xerces Society. Based in Sacramento, California, Angela is working on habitat restoration for pollinators and monarch butterflies in the Central Valley. Her role at the Xerces Society also involves incorporating climate resiliency into pollinator restoration projects. Angela has over 20 years of experience studying arthropods in grassland habitats, including studies of how climate change can affect species interactions. She received an MS in ecology from Utah State University and a PhD in biology from the University of Notre Dame. So I'll hand it off to you, Angela, to start off this last presentation.
Thanks. So next slide. I'm really excited to be here today. Hilary and I are going to be talking about the work that our organizations do to protect monarchs in California. Next. I'm with the Xerces Society. We are a nonprofit focused on invertebrate conservation. Next slide. Most of our work in California, next slide. Most of our work in California focuses on pollinators and monarch butterflies. Monarchs, I think, are probably one of the best known and best loved butterflies in the US. Here we see a monarch nectaring on milkweed. Milkweed is the host plant for monarchs, so that means that the caterpillars can only mature to adults if they're feeding on milkweed. Next. And you can click once more. So this is a map of the migration patterns for monarchs. So there are two populations of monarchs. The eastern monarchs overwinter in Mexico and breed east of the Rocky Mountains. The western monarchs breed west of the Rocky Mountains and overwinter on the California coast. And monarchs have this cool biology where when they're overwintering, they form these clusters in trees, as you see here. It's really cool. They can get so thick they turn the trees orange when you look at them from aerial view. Next. So this behavior makes it really easy for us to count them when they're overwintering. So there are some data from the 1980s indicating that there were about 4 million butterflies overwintering in California. In 1997, Xerces partnered with Mia Monroe from the National Park System to start the Western Monarch Thanksgiving count. So this is a community science project. We have hundreds of amazing volunteers who help us count the monarchs in these trees while they're overwintering. And you can get more information or look at, if you're interested in volunteering or just want more data, you can get that from westernmonarchcount.org. Next. So the next slide has the data, maybe. Can we get next slide? Am I able to advance it? Can you do the next slide, please? I don't know what's happening.
Carolyn, are you able to advance the slide? Oh, there we go.
Okay, and you can click once more. So these are the data from the Thanksgiving count. So the green bars are the number of butterflies per year. So when we started the count in 97, there were 1.2 million butterflies along the coast. And then that number kind of dropped and sort of hovered around 200,000. You can see that in this blue line shows us the number of sites monitored. So in about 2010, that line starts to increase, meaning that we had more, these amazing volunteers helping us. And so we were able to look at more sites, but the number of monarchs stays relatively similar, meaning that we're finding fewer butterflies per site. If you click again, in 2018 and 2019, you can see that bar gets really low. So the number of monarchs dropped from about 200,000 to less than 30,000. So it's an 86% drop from 2017 and a 99.4% decline from the 1980s. Next. So the next question is, why is this happening? Why are we seeing this big decline? And there are several reasons. The first is habitat loss and degradation in the overwintering sites, and habitat loss and degradation in the breeding sites. Insecticides are a big problem, especially pesticides. Climate change plays a role, and then parasites, diseases, and predators can also play a role. Next. So when these numbers declined, Xerces put out a call to action for the Western monarch. So these are the things that people can do to immediately help Western monarchs. So the first is protecting and managing California overwintering sites. The second is restoring breeding and migratory habitat in California. And so California is a really important part of their range, and that's exciting because it means that any conservation work we do here in California has the potential to have a really big impact on protecting these animals. We need to protect monarchs and their habitat from pesticides. We need to protect breeding and migratory habitat in the West outside of California. And then we need to continue research so that we can improve our management suggestions for these species. Next. So there's no formal protection for the overwintering sites in California, and sites continue to be lost, sometimes from development, but other things like fire or senescence of the trees. They need to be actively managed. So Xerces is working with managers of several important overwintering sites to create active management plans and restore some of these sites. And that work is funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board. Next. Breeding habitat for monarchs should contain native milkweed. As I said, the larvae, the caterpillars need milkweed. Adult monarchs are generalists and will take nectar from a variety of plants. So we think that flowers that bloom early spring and late fall may be especially important for supporting their migration. They also need habitat that's protected from pesticides, high levels of pathogens, and other features. We have some data from the last few years indicating that monarchs prefer to lay eggs on shaded milkweed. Next. So this is a map of our work in California. We do on-the-ground restoration with partners in public lands, ag lands, urban areas. We also provide technical guidance to managers and landowners. So if you have questions about monarchs or pollinators, you can contact us and we can help you out. If you're a producer, if you're a farmer or rancher, we also have some partner biologists with the NRCS that can help you if you're interested in supporting pollinators or monarchs on your land. Last year, we started the Xerces Habitat Kit program. So this is a program to provide plant materials for partners who are already doing restoration work. So we're trying to expand our ability to get habitat into the ground, and also recognizing that a lot of times the plants are really expensive and that can be limiting, and it's also be difficult to decide what species to use. So we worked with Hedgerow Farms, which is a native plant nursery in winters, and this year we're working with Hedgerow and also Floral Native Nursery to create these kits that include native, drought-tolerant plants that monarchs and pollinators love. And we have some regionally appropriate kits. You can buy them. We also sent out applications to provide these for free. So last year we provided 32 kits, including 25 that went to resource conservation districts, which Hillary will talk about next. This year, we just chose 23 partners to receive the kits for free. We work with a variety of partners, and this map shows where our habitat restoration work has been so far. So you can see most of our work is in ag lands, which is in green, but we also work in urban areas, which are in orange, and natural areas are in pink. And the stars show where our kits went to last year. Next. So as I said, most of our work is within ag lands. We work with farmers to create pollinator habitat and also create plans to reduce pesticide risk. Here you see a hedgerow on the left. Hedgerows are great for providing habitat and also increasing habitat connectivity. They act like roadways for pollinators. Next. We work in natural areas. So these are pictures of 2 wildlife reserves that received kits. The one on the left is in LA County, and Master Gardeners took the lead on that one. The one on the right is the San Luis Wildlife Refuge, and they had volunteers and some Boy Scout troop come out to help plant the kit. Next. We also do work in urban areas. So this is an example of a pollinator garden we planted here in Sacramento, and we had several school groups come and help plant, and this is one of the groups. They were high school STEM class that was really excited about gardening, and one of the students even asked if he could come out and just work in the garden on the weekend. So that was really fun. Next. So I talked about the Thanksgiving count. We have some other community science programs, including the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. So if you're out and about and you see a monarch, either an adult or a caterpillar, or you see milkweed, you can take a picture of it and log it on this website. And it helps us learn more about the biology of these species when they're at different parts of their range, what they're doing. It really helps And if you click again, if you're on iNaturalist, which the Secretary mentioned earlier, you can join the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper project and just contribute data through that project. Next. Xerces has a variety of resources on our website that you can download for free. So we've got stuff on milkweeds, we've got best management practices for monarchs, we have plant lists, we have information on planting hedgerows and cover crops. One you might be interested in on the left is our quick guide to monarch habitat on farms in the Central Valley. Even if you're not in the Central Valley or you're not a farmer, I think it has a lot of great information on creating monarch habitat in sort of a compact form. And that is it. I guess next slide. Thank you everyone for coming. And next up, Hillary is going to talk about her work with the California RCDs.
Great, thank you so much, Angela, for that overview of monarch conservation. And to finish up today's pollinator panel, I'll be talking about the network of resource conservation districts, which is abbreviated as RCDs, and how we're working with partners to expand monarch conservation statewide. And then I'll conclude with how you could connect to your local RCD. Next slide, please. So first, I want to talk about what is an RCD, because I am assuming some folks don't know. So resource conservation districts are special districts of the state that work directly with public and private landowners to conserve natural resources. There are 95 RCDs distributed throughout California, and you can see them on the map. The gray areas are the only areas where there are not a RCD currently active. RCDs are staffed by conservation professionals with in-depth knowledge of resource management who work to develop and nurture long-term relationships with local land managers. And because RCDs are non-regulatory and the activities they support are most often voluntary, they can act as a bridge between government agency conservation programs and private landowners who want to conserve natural resources on their properties. So RCDs are often the boots on the ground, implementing successful conservation strategies on both natural and working lands. Next slide, please. So when RCDs work together, they actually become a powerful network able to enact large-scale change while having meaningful local impacts. The California Association of RCDs, which is the organization I work for and which I'll probably abbreviate as CARCD, is a nonprofit that acts as a hub for this RCD network. And we help to coordinate their work to ensure that it has as much impact as possible and is able to address key and emerging issues of statewide and local importance. Next slide, please. In terms of monarch conservation, we do this in a variety of ways, including by connecting RCDs to partners and providing appropriate information and tools. We also foster sharing of information between RCDs so that they can learn from one another's successes. And we directly support program development by connecting individual districts to monarch-related funding opportunities. Next slide. So this is just a smattering of some of the partners we work with throughout the state, because we recognize that in order to make a meaningful difference in monarch conservation, we need to work together with a variety of partners, play to our strengths, and coordinate to maximize both our effectiveness and efficiency, because none of us can save the monarch alone. Next slide. So these partnerships are key to making RCDs as successful as possible. We're able to learn best management practices with partners such as Xerces, who have more than a decade of monarch conservation under their belt. And both the Xerces Society and the Monarch Joint Venture are currently providing webinar-based trainings to RCDs, as well as offering direct technical assistance with planning and implementation of on-the-ground projects. Our partners can also help marshal resources to make restoration possible, such as helping develop local seed sources for plant materials or providing plant materials for free, as Angela described. Next slide. So RCD monarch conservation programs are mostly targeted on working lands because we recognize the important role that farmers and ranchers can and have played in large-scale species conservation efforts. By creating habitat in field edges or pastures, or by protecting existing habitat patches, farmers and ranchers can help transform agricultural landscapes into areas that provide important breeding and migratory resources for monarchs. And this slide shows photos of ranchers collecting milkweed seeds and also watering a breeding habitat planting area. So they take an active role in engaging in these conservation activities. Next slide, please. So here I've listed just a few of the CDFA and NRCS conservation practices that can be adapted to support monarch conservation, usually by incorporating milkweed or flowering plants into planting pallets. And so if a farmer adopts these practices, then they often can apply for financial assistance to implement these conservation activities through, say, CDFA's Healthy Soils program or NRCS's EQIP Environmental Quality Incentives program or their CSP program. And these practices could also get written into conservation plans or carbon farm plans that can help farmers incorporate these practices in ways that meet their farm or ranch goals, but also benefit monarchs and other pollinators. Next slide. So if you want to learn more about these practices, I think the best place I could refer you to is NRCS's Working Lands for Monarch Butterflies document, which is shown here. Next slide. So it provides comprehensive charts that describe the various conservation practices and even has pictures. And it also includes how they help monarchs and what the other added benefits are. So some practices might also improve groundwater recharge in addition to supporting monarchs and other pollinators. And right now, I'm going to quickly zero in on two widely used practices, hedgerow plantings and riparian restoration, and focus on two current RCD projects. Next slide. So in the winter of 2019, Yolo County RCD, which is located in the Sacramento Valley, partnered with the Center for Land-Based Learning Student and Landowner Education and Watershed Stewardship Program, which is also known as SLUES, to plant a monarch and pollinator hedgerow. This 800-foot hedgerow incorporated 1,200 nectar plants, including 400 milkweed plugs, which were provided by the Xerces Society through those pollinator habitat kits. Next slide. Already, the hedgerow is providing a diverse array of nectar sources similar to those that Neil highlighted in the very first talk, and these were seeded into the hedgerow to provide initial habitat as the woody plants mature. And I didn't mention, I assume most of you know, but a hedgerow is just a linear planting along the edge of a field and can achieve multiple benefits, carbon sequestration, pollinator habitat, etc. So this hedgerow that Yolo RCD helped plant is going to provide breeding and nectar habitat to monarchs and also for other pollinators for the next 15 to 30 years, depending on the lifespan of this hedgerow. And the Center for Land-Based Learning and Yolo County RCD will use it as a learning tool during workshops and other field-based events. Next slide. So if we skip down to the Bay Area, Alameda County RCD has been working to expand milkweed availability in rangelands. And this past winter, they worked with the California Conservation Corps to plant another Xerces habitat kit along a few riparian areas on the 3 Calhoun Sisters Ranch. So monarchs often use riparian corridors during their migration, which is one of the reasons that the Alameda County RCD chose to focus on a riparian area planting. But they also wanted to enhance woody and understory habitat to help sequester carbon, as this habitat was actually designed as part of the 3 Calhoun Sisters carbon farm plan. And one of the other neat things I want to highlight about this project is that it's actually trialing the success of plantings in settings both with and without irrigation. Because unlike in cropland settings, irrigation is often unavailable in rangelands. So what they did is they planted 3 habitat areas, only one of which is irrigated and the other 2 are in an ephemeral drainage near a pond. And they're looking at the success, and they plan to share information from this trial with other RCDs so that they can use it as a guide for future plantings and rangeland settings. Next slide.
Hi, Hillary. Just a time check that you have a couple more minutes left.
Perfect. I'm about to wrap up. So those were just two examples of the monarch conservation projects that RCDs are currently working on, but there are many, many more. In 2019, the California Association of RCDs was awarded a Wildlife Conservation Board block grant, which we distributed to RCDs throughout the state. And you can see some of those projects on the map. And they're accomplishing an array of projects, including overwintering site assessments, breeding and nectar habitat restoration, and technical assistance. And these projects will be paired with outreach and education events to share their successes and also hopefully recruit additional partners for future projects. Next slide. So in addition to this grant funding, CARCD is also working with RCDs to identify opportunities to layer monarch conservation into existing programs such as carbon farm, range management, and fire recovery programs. We think that by working within existing programs, RCDs will be able to leverage funding and create multifunctional habitat that has benefits far beyond monarch conservation. Next slide. So this map highlights the RCDs that are currently developing or expanding their monarch conservation programs, and combined, this represents the potential to support conservation activity on thousands of acres throughout California. Next slide. So if you want to work with your local RCD on a monarch conservation or other type of project, I encourage you to go to CARCD's website, and you can click on Find Your Local RCD, and you will be directed to the RCD in your region. Next slide. You can also support RCDs in their monarch conservation work in a variety of ways. They're chronically underfunded, so donations can help them expand their capacity to offer innovative and timely conservation programs. You can also volunteer with your local district and participate in an implementation or educational program. Please let other folks know about the important work RCDs are doing. And finally, if you do have a project you need help with, you can partner with RCDs for assistance with all aspects of project management, from planning all the way through to monitoring. Next slide. So thank you so much, and feel free to contact me to connect to RCDs or learn more about their work. And with that, I would like to thank our funders, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Wildlife Conservation Board, our amazing array of partners, and of course CDFA for hosting this wonderful webinar. I've learned a ton today from the other presenters, and I want to wish everyone a happy Pollinator Week.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, Hillary and Angela, and what beautiful, fascinating slides. And thanks to all the presenters. It really was a lot of great information, and just wonderful to see all the efforts going on. So at this point, we do have some time for questions and answers. And reminder to go ahead and put those in the chat box. And I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn to kind of moderate the Q&A part here. And just to remind you folks that may have tuned in a little bit later, we will be recording this webinar and making it available up on our website. And we apologize if we're not able to answer all the questions. So Carolyn, do we have any questions lined up?
Yes, we do have some questions. Thank you. This is Carolyn Cook with CDFA's Office of Environmental Farming. I've been driving the controls and reviewing some of the questions that folks have put into our question box. So I will be asking them to the panel members. And first question is, can someone clearly distinguish the difference between a pollinator and a pollinizer?
Do you want to assign that to one of us, or?
That seems like a pretty broad question, but Dr. Williams, if you can provide the answer, that would be great.
Okay, I think Josette would be another good one too for this one. I think I'm understanding the question. So the question was a little bit quiet when you asked it, but the difference between a pollinator and a pollinizer.
Yes.
Yeah, so when we talk about pollinators, those are animals, primarily insects, that move pollen between flowers, leading to fertilization and production of fruits. So those are pollinators, things like bees and some butterflies, etc. Pollinizers, in the use that we use it within agriculture, refers to one crop line or crop type that's planted with another, and we often harvest the yield from one, and the pollinizer is the one that donates the pollen that a pollinator would move, hopefully, that allows for that successful yield on the other. So the pollinizer is the crop strain that is used to provide pollen for setting fruit.
And just to add to that, yes, in the almond industry, the vast majority of acreage here in California requires 2 different almond varieties to be planted together, because there's a evolutionary adaptation that was useful to the evolution of almonds, but not so useful to almond growers, and that is that they're genetically incompatible with self-pollinization. So commonly, if you drive up and down California, there's actually 2 different almond varieties. One is the pollinizer, which is oftentimes the less valuable, but we do still harvest from it, and then the major variety. So nonpareil is the most common variety here in California, but there are half a dozen common pollinizer almond varieties that are planted with nonpareil.
Okay, thank you so much. This question here seems like it would be good for Dr. Laws. Can you comment on the importance and impact of promoting pollinator forage, including trees, in urban areas versus agricultural lands?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all important. I think that, you know, in terms of monarchs and pollinators, it's sort of an all hands on deck. So I think it's important to put in habitat wherever we can, provided that it can be protected from pesticides. And in terms of pollinators in general, I think that there are a lot of butterflies and moths that use native trees. So planting native trees in urban areas can really support those types of pollinators.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Williams, are there seed mixes for bees that can be effective regardless of the location in the United States? You know, folks see companies promoting Save the Bees like seed packets, and there's the asker here is wondering if there's unintended consequences to planting seeds that might not be appropriate.
Yeah, I missed the middle part of your reading, but I can try to generally answer it. So I think we would favor, and it's probably true for most of the people on the call or everyone on the call, targeting seed mixes that are regionally appropriate. And by regionally appropriate, that mostly means just species that are going to be able to grow in the climate and the soils that you have in your region. So that is one reason why our work has tended to target California native plants. I don't believe that that's the only way to go in terms of habitat enhancements for working landscapes, but I do think that regardless of whether you're using combinations of natives or adapted non-native species, depending on your goal or your perspective, you do want to be using ones that are regionally designed. I think going with seed that is just general or planted to different areas is likely to be less successful. There might be some species that make a go of it, but in general, less successful.
Okay, thank you. This question here might be for our monarch experts. I recently read an article that most milkweed has high levels of pesticides. Are there any comments or remedies regarding that?
Yeah, I can respond to that because Xerces helped collect some of that data. If you're talking about the article from California, we collected milkweed or leaves from milkweeds from over 200 plants throughout the northern Central Valley, and every single one had pesticides, and that includes the ones from national wildlife refuges. It sadly includes the milkweed collected from the backyards of Xerces employees who do not use pesticides. And so drift is a real problem, and I think that there are ways to try and mitigate drift in agricultural areas. We heard about some of that from Gisette that the almond board is focusing on, so that's really important. I think in urban areas, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to reduce pesticide use because most of it is cosmetic rather than for economic reasons. So people just stop, spraying around their homes. That can make a real impact. But yeah, it's a real problem. It's really concerning, and it's something that we need to get a handle on, not just for monarchs, but for pollinators in general.
Thank you. This one might be a good question for anybody on the panel, but where can I find a list of preferred honey and wild bee food sources?
I know that this is Gisette from the Almond Board. I know that Pollinator Partnership has on their website a planting guide for all regions of the country that provides recommendations on locally adapted plants that are good forage for honeybees and native pollinators.
Yeah, there are many different sources. There are lists through, Pollinator Partnership would have some. Also, the Xerces Society has lists. You can go to our webpage, the Williams Lab webpage at UC Davis has very specific ones designed, for example, for almond landscape that split the plants up by season and rank them in terms of the ones that were most used and valuable for bees. So lots of different places to go.
Great, thank you. This one's an interesting one for me and relevant for our agricultural community. How do you suggest controlling weeds in cover crops without endangering pollinators? Perhaps, Dr. Williams or Dr. Sardinas?
I'm also happy to weigh in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Hillary, do you want to start?
No, Neil, you go for it. I'm not as up to date on cover crops.
So we're working on cover crops now, and that is in collaboration with the Almond Board. There are a couple of things to note. One, so weed management can be achieved by first proper site preparation, in that there are a variety of options. For very, very small areas, there's something called solarization. You could look into that. That's a non-chemical way of preparing the ground. When you're growing under an orchard, if it's an orchard cover crop, that's less realistic. But the orchards are generally long-term managed to mitigate weed pressure. And so the ground prep is pretty good in terms of weeds. The next way I'd say it's important is to adjust the seeding density of the cover crop and the selection of species used to be as competitive as possible against the things that you don't care for, and to establish strongly from the beginning. Finally, I would say that some weeds that are not your target are actually not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it has to be the way you decide weeds. If they're not impacting the performance of the mix in a positive way, I don't think that some of these non-target species that end up being there are a problem. And I think we just have to recognize that is the case, especially if you're growing trees, whether you have some non-target, wildflowers in there or other things, may not be really that big a deal. So I think those three are important. Josette may have other things to add.
Yeah, I would add that the some grower experience has shown that planting a cover crop can actually be a way of controlling the most noxious weeds for the reason that Neil outlined in terms of competition. So cover crops can actually be part of noxious weed management. As part of our environmentally friendly pest management goal that I spoke about, we're also really encouraging growers to do spot spraying for weeds that actually can compete with the almond trees, particularly in a young orchard, rather than broadcast spraying, so as to limit the amount and the area that's covered by any herbicides. And then lastly, we have a really robust research program, and we'll be ramping up grower demonstrations starting with this year's almond harvest to looking at how off-ground harvesting of almonds can be a valuable step forward in terms of sustainability, because without, currently we shake the trees and the almonds dry on the floor of the orchard, and that is where weed management can become a hindrance to both the food safety aspects of those almonds drying, as well as the yield that's collected then when you pick up those almonds off the orchard floor. So off-ground harvesting we see as a really potentially major advancement in helping manage a whole suite of different sustainability issues within almond orchards, including weed management.
Great, thank you, Josette and Neil. And I think at this point we're gonna have to say goodbye. We've reached the end of the allotted time. I want to thank our speakers and panelists so much. I want to thank my team for helping us put this on. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in and joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to CDFA at the email address on here. We will be making this available at a later date. And want to let you know CDFA will be continuing our celebration of Pollinator Week through our webinar and our e-blast to the stakeholders. We've also produced a few little short videos, so make sure to follow us on Twitter. Our handle is CDFA Climate News. And yeah, thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and end it at this time. So thank you.